I turned 32 last spring, though I don't feel older so much as more distilled, pared down to the version of myself that remains when everything decorative has been scraped away. I've always known my place in my family, one step behind my sister, just outside the glow cast on her by everyone who mattered. Leia, 3 years older, arrived in the world already wearing a halo. People cooed at her, teachers praised her, relatives leaned toward her like plants turning to light. She married at 24, gifted my parents with 2 grandsons by 27, baked bread that rose like a benediction. She lived in a magazine, or tried to. I lived across town in a quiet apartment where nothing rose unless I set a timer. I built a life of steady, unflashy choices, contributions to a 401k, a Roth IRA, a growing savings account. I learned to rely only on myself, and I thought my independence was something to be respected. But in my family, independence without a wedding band was like a cake without sugar. Technically food, but nothing to celebrate. Mom and Dad, Marianne and Victor, never said anything cutting out right. They never had to. Their questions slouched under the weight of implication each time I visited. Don't you want children someday, Elena? Your sister's boys are growing so fast. You're still in that little apartment? I learned to nod, to swallow responses that would only invite more scrutiny. I fixed their Wi-Fi, updated their phones, brought bottles of wine to family dinners when they forgot whose birthday it was this time. My usefulness became my currency. I hoped quietly, foolishly, that they noticed. Then the porcelain life they paraded cracked. Leia discovered her husband Derek had been cheating for years. Either she stumbled across the messages by accident or she finally looked straight at the truth she'd been pushing aside. She filed for divorce. Derek evaporated with their savings and his apologies, leaving her with 2 young boys, Noah and Caleb, and a stack of bills tall enough to cast shadows. Words from the family were generous, almost poetic in their sympathy. But generosity that costs nothing is easy to give. Their savings, they said, were locked away for someday. Their tone suggested someday was always on the horizon, never close enough to touch. I didn't hesitate. I paid Leia's legal retainer. I covered 6 months of her rent. I watched the boys on weekends so she could breathe without something small clinging to her sleeve. I helped because she was hurting, because the boys needed stability, because I'd long ago learned to be the reliable one. I never kept score. I just hoped someone would quietly, maybe privately, realize how much of myself I was pouring into a wound that wasn't mine. Then came a Wednesday. Mom called, voice bright enough to sound practiced. "We have good news," she said. "Come by tonight." I drove over tired from work, curiosity keeping me upright. The living room was arranged like a stage dad in his recliner, Mom perched on the edge of the sofa, Leia beside her like she'd been carefully placed. A manila folder sat on the coffee table. "It's Leia's new house," Dad said, "and you'll take the mortgage." For a moment, the room tilted. I'm not sure if I set the folder down or if it fell from my fingers. I only know I left before my voice could splinter. The night air felt colder than it should have. The calls began that Saturday. People who hadn't bothered sending me a holiday card in a decade suddenly discovered my number. Kelsey, my cousin, began her voicemail with, "I heard what you did," in the tone of a judge announcing a verdict. Uncle Neil left a 60-second sermon about family duty. Aunt Carol coated her voice in sugar before sharpening it. "You're not getting younger, Elena. At least help your sisters, boys." I blocked them one by one until my phone felt lighter, as if shedding their expectations gave it room to breathe. 2 months passed in the hush after a storm. I jogged before sunrise, cooked simple dinners, let my evenings stretch out again until they felt like mine. Peace felt unfamiliar, but welcome. Then a thick envelope landed on my doormat like a brick. My last name printed on the front in a font I'd come to associate with institutions. I slid it open with a butter knife. Plaintiffs, Marianne and Victor Hart. Amount demanded, $350,000. Itemized as food, clothing, emotional support, and last on the list funds to complete Leia's mortgage. I laughed once, sharp and startled, the sound tearing out of me before the shock settled. Then I called a lawyer. Priya Ellison was brisk, calm, and entirely unimpressed by the complaint. "They have no claim," she said, flipping through the pages. "Parents owe care to minors. Adults owe themselves." For 3 weeks, I became an archivist of my own generosity. I dug through email folders and banking apps I barely opened. Bank transfers I'd sent my parents when their pensions dipped. The $7,200 in rent. I'd covered for Laya. The $5,500 divorce retainer. Screenshots of texts reading, "Just a little help this month." Receipts blossomed like ghosts from corners of my life I hadn't thought about in years. I slept poorly, woke angry, worked, and repeated the cycle until anger burned down to something steadier. Court smelled like dust, disinfectant, and the faint panic of people hoping not to lose. My grandparents, Arthur and May, sat behind me, hands folded, 2 anchors holding me to the moment. Across the aisle, my parents performed composure like it earned points. Leia stared at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet my eyes. The judge, gray at the temples, asked simply, "Why this sum, and why now?" "To help our other daughter," my mother answered as though it were obvious. "So this is a mortgage dressed as memory," the judge said, uninterested in their script. "Proceed." The questioning was not cruel, but precise enough to scrape varnish from every attempted justification. Why assume I would pay? Why purchase a house beyond Laya's means? Why tie guilt to generosity? My parents' replies sounded reasonable until Priya's follow-up sliced them open. Exhibits were marked, transfers highlighted. A timeline of me being financially independent since 18 was laid out in stark lines. A week later, the ruling arrived. "Claim denied. Parents do not invoice their children for childhood," the judge wrote. "Evidence shows Miss Hart has been a giver, not a debtor." He added, almost gently, "I am disappointed by the plaintiff's expectations." The gavel struck wood like a door closing. I didn't celebrate. I stepped outside and tilted my face toward the sun, letting warmth replace something that had gone cold. May hugged me tight. Arthur murmured, "That's that," though we all knew it wasn't quite. In the weeks that followed, my mother visited my grandparents to request an early inheritance for the grandchildren's stability. They said no. She left in silence. Months passed quiet ones this time. I bought a small bungalow painted the color of soft fog. I painted the kitchen a yellow, bright enough to summon light on rainy days. I planted tomatoes in the backyard and adopted a gray cat who sleeps curled beside my laptop like a guardian of unfinished thoughts. Leia rented out her house and moved back in with our parents. They manage. I don't call, and they don't reach out until a year later. An email. "We heard you bought a house. Since you have extra space, Leia and the boys should move in. Let us know when. Love, Mom and Dad." I replied with 11 words. "I won't host them. Please don't contact me with further demands. Send." Days passed. Light pooled across my kitchen counter. I locked the windows, partly because May reminded me to be careful, partly because boundaries hold better when the doors to old patterns stay shut. I'm seeing someone now, Rowan Hale, who is kind in the quiet ways that matter. He doesn't pry, and I don't offer explanations he hasn't asked for. Sometimes I think of Noah and Caleb. I hope they're okay. Maybe someday they'll find me when they're grown and allowed to choose their own truths. If they do, I'll tell them this. Peace isn't granted. It's chosen, defended, kept.